All right, so in Photoshop, my screen is going to look considerably different than yours. This is the retouching workspace that I use. I'm going to show you how to build this space. How many people in here are actually working with a custom workspace in Photoshop? Yeah, well, you were given the thing that they've given you, which is unfortunate, but nonetheless, this is how my screen will always look. Yes?
Sorry, not to cut you off. I'm using the school's computer.
Yep.
I just used my school login
Right.
for Adobe, and it came up with an error message saying something went wrong.
Try to restart that computer. I'm going to keep going on here. Don't worry, you're going to see it, and there's a printout of all of this stuff. Here, let me take a look really quick before you restart.
Should I save, like, do you see the files that you had me?
They're supposed to stay on your partition in here. Okay. Try starting Photoshop again. Let's just see what happens.
Had already put it on, then popped up.
Yeah, of course they don't have it down here.
It popped up automatically.
Double click on this guy,
Okay.
and then go to Applications, and then go Photoshop. Yep. And then click on that guy. And then your sign in, yes. Yeah, but I think you're on the right track. Did you get this far last time?
Yeah.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, and this is when it kicked you out?
Yeah.
Okay, wait, hang on. I'm going to stay with you then.
Sorry, maybe I took it in. I don't know. After I put in dual mode, it didn't work. Maybe I took it in the wrong mode.
All right, not typing in. Try again. Oh yeah, no, you're on. So this is you're where you sort of need to be. Okay. So anyway, getting back to this, I'm going to show you how to build this workspace for retouching. It gives you everything that you, well, not everything that you want, but it gives you a lot of what you want and a lot of what you need. The reason this looks alien to a lot of you guys is there's probably some stuff up here that you've never seen or never known how to work with, whatever. You are not required to work in this workspace, but I can promise you that it makes it infinitely easier to do the work that we're doing in this class. But again, these are optional things. You're more than welcome to use your own workspace if you've got one, or to use the default if you've got one. But all of the videos that you see, all of the recordings of my screen are going to look just like this. So anyway, something to think about. But before we get to that, I actually want to get to setting up preferences in Photoshop. There's a number of things in Photoshop that are by default wrong. And so we actually need to make sure that it functions for us in the sort of the best, safest way possible to do that. So to get to preferences in Macintosh, you come up to the Photoshop menu, down to preferences and across to general. I think on Windows, don't quote me on this, but I think it's at the bottom of the edit menu. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, for the people who are on Windows, go to your edit menu and it's down at the bottom and grab preferences. From this point on, it should be pretty much the actual same part. There's a set of possible preferences that are along the left-hand side, and then if you click on any one of those, the options are up in the middle. So the first thing that I do, and again, these are all, I'm going to tell you why I do it. Yes?
How did you get there for Mac?
For Mac. So again, up to the word Photoshop, and come down to Preferences, over to General. So I'm going to tell you the way I set things, and I'm going to tell you why I set them that way. And then it's entirely up to you whether you want to work with it that way or not, okay? I'm telling you and why I do it, but if you are comfortable working in another way and whatever, this is elective for you as well. Does that sort of make sense? So I'm going to just tell you what I do. I'm going to tell you why I do it, and then we'll go on from there. The first thing that I do is I uncheck the auto show the home screen, because that's nothing but a fucking ad for Photoshop, and I hate it. I want to go in and do my work, so I uncheck that. Use legacy new document interface. It is much more intuitive than the new one that they actually did. So I use the old version. It allows you to do things that the new one actually doesn't allow you to do. The new one, again, it's like it's great for people who do really canned sizes and that sort of stuff. But for anybody who is doing anything less than that, the old version of it was much, 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 much better. Use legacy free transform. This is the process where it used to be, if you were going to do a transform, so you were going to change the width and the height of something, if you held down the shift, if you just started to transform, you could transform the width independent of the height, which would distort your image. They didn't keep the ratio between width and height. In order to keep that ratio, you had to hold down the shift key. I don't like the new behavior. There's a problem that we run into, and we're going to get into it along about session 8 or 9, when we actually try to transform in perspective. And if you try to transform in perspective using the new transform, it does not work. So by going back to the old way that it's actually done, you are able and capable of transforming in perspective, and that's not something you want to change back and forth. I do click beep when done. There are things that will actually happen in this class that take so long. If you run a filter on a 2 gigabyte file and it's going to take 30 seconds to do it, it's nice to have your computer tell you it's done. That 30 seconds gives you time to go to the bathroom, to get stoned, and it gives you a chance to do something in your life other than stare at your computer and wait for the filter to run. I do not export clipboard. Uncheck that. It's checked by default. It is a memory killer. Nobody copies an image in Photoshop via the clipboard to get it somewhere else. They export it and bring it in some other way, whatever. This will eat up valuable memory for you that will slow your computer down. Nobody uses this. Uncheck it. The rest of this can actually be left at its defaults. If we go to the next tab down, interface. In interface, you can actually change the surround of your computer. I personally like the default one, which is this dark gray. Again, one of the issues that we've got is environment. And this is the other reason that Photoshop, you'll see, all of their palettes are neutral grays. All of this is all to give you no influence of color. If these things were colored, if this was like a pink window that we were looking at right now, that would throw a pink cast on your image, and when you started to do color correction, you would be fighting the pink cast that was not in your image, but that was a consequence of something on your screen. So personally, I like this one. There are people that will actually go to a white one like this. It is a huge mistake because we interpret color based on the brightest element in anything that we look at, whether it's a computer screen or a wall or the sky or anything that we look at. We actually do a color balance based on the brightest thing of an image. This actually then becomes the brightest thing of your image, and it is not your image. So it will set it up as a false. You will not be able to do the correction that you're actually hoping to be able to do. So I leave it on the darker one. The really dark one right here gets a little too dark. It's a little too, I don't like the dark interface as well, so that's just me. Again, that's the way I would do it. If you find that the text in the screens are all too small, you can actually change. This is the user interface. You can actually make your text larger. I'm going to leave mine at small. I don't have enough room on my computer anyway. And the rest of these can stay at their default. Next one down, workspace. In workspace, and now this is something that's very particular to me, but you guys can do whatever you want. The two things that I turn off here that are usually on by default are this open documents as tabs and enable floating document window docking. What that means is that if you open multiple images, the first one, open documents as tabs. If you open multiple images, they open up as tabs just like they do in a browser. You'll see little tabs along the top, and one image will actually be showing, and then you know that there's 2 or 3, if you've got 3 images, there's 3 tabs, 4 images, there's 4 tabs. It lets you navigate. The problem that we have with that in retouching, especially in compositing, is that we are constantly in compositing doing work between 2 images while we are able to see them both at the same time. If I need to steal color from image A to put it in image B, if A is a tab, I can't get to it. I can't get that unless I select it. And once I select it, I've lost my reference to it in B. So for me, I don't like tab behavior, so I turn it off. Enable floating document window docking, what that means is that if you do have separate windows and you actually bring one up close enough to the top of another one, they will automatically become tabs as well. And I hate that behavior, so I turn it off there. The next one down, tools. In the tools, one of the latest things that they've done with Photoshop is that they've actually, I do leave on show tooltips because it'll give you a quick reference about what something is. But the show rich tooltips are little videos that they play. So if you're hovering over the brush, all of a sudden you get a flyout screen that's a little video that covers up your info palette and part of your history palette, depending on the tool you picked. I hate that, so I don't. I leave that part off. The rest of this part is all default. Yep. And the rest can stay that way. History log. How many people here ever use a history log? Why? Okay. Well, there is a reason to use history log. Let me ask you this. Anybody in here in their wildest imagination would ever consider being a professional retoucher? Not a consideration for any of you. What if I told you the top retoucher in New York is making $250,000 a year? Would that change your mind? So how many people in here would at least consider it as would be open-minded if the opportunity came along? Okay, much better answer, right? So for those people, history log matters, and this is why it matters. It's off by default. If you click it on, you'll actually see that you have options that you can actually save your log as metadata, a text file, or both. And then what you can save is on a drop-down menu, sessions only, concise, or detailed. So what this means is that for sessions only with metadata, what this means is that every time you open and close a file, there is a timestamp that gets put into the metadata of your file. How many people in this room do not know what metadata is? So if I ask you those questions and you really don't know, don't be embarrassed. Put your hand up, because if somebody else will certainly. So metadata is data about data. So whenever you open up a file, typically a raw file that you've done, if you've set up your copyright correctly on your camera, it puts the copyright into the file. It's not actually in the image itself. It's in a header about the image. So it's also the date you shot it on, the camera that you shot it with, the lens that you shot it with, the shutter speed that you used, the white balance setting. All of that is metadata. So this simply copies, oh, he opened it and he closed it, and it copies it into a place in the metadata, right? And it doesn't mean anything. It's not going to help you out at all. The next thing down, if we go down to concise, what concise does, and this again, we'll still embed it in the metadata, concise will actually not only open, it'll tag it for every time your file is open and every time it's closed, but it'll also say every time you picked a tool. So you picked the brush tool, but that's all it says. So he opened the file, he grabbed the brush tool, he closed the file. That's all it'll actually show you, right? Finally, if you go down to detailed, what detailed does is everything that was open and closed, every tool that was picked, but everything you did. Stroke 1, stroke 2, stroke 3. If you use the pen tool, he put a point here, the next point here, the next point here, the next point here. It is exhaustive. It's encyclopedic. Does that make sense? So you're thinking, well, why would anybody do that? I'm going to tell you. Most people do not put this stuff in the metadata. it won't make your file grow that big because it's basically just text. You can save it as a text file. So you can come and you can click on text, and it'll open up a window and it'll say, okay, you want to save this log as a text file. We'll do that. You need to name it. If you're going to do this, you have to name it after your file. Every file that you work on has its own history. So do not leave this big thing that says Photoshop edit log. That is not correct. If you have a file that's called flowers198, you have a log for flower 198. If you've got flowers 199, you have a different log for 199. Does that make sense? So your text log is always tied right to your file. So you know, oh, this is the text file. This is the history of what I did on this image. Does that make sense? So I'm not going to do that right now. You can actually do both. And if you click on both, it will save a text file and it also will embed it in your metadata. However, here is the trick. You do a text file, go ahead and name it. I'm just going to leave this name on for mine. I'm going to throw it in my toss folder just so that we can go to the next part right here. You can choose where to put this thing, but here's the reason you do it, and you do the detailed one. You do a job for somebody, and it's a $2,500 retouching job. Not that unusual. It's either a really serious beauty job, maybe half a dozen high-end fashion pieces, something like that, $2,500, and you go to them and you say, here it is, and they say, well, fuck, I'm not paying you $2,500 for that. What did you do? The worst thing about retouching is that if you do it really well, it doesn't look like you did anything. You do know that, right? They just look perfect. Well, what did you do? I didn't do anything, right? So when they say, I'm not paying you $2,500 because what did you do? This is the size of your text file. It literally, they're like phone books. And you pick it up and you walk in and you go, I did that, you fucker, give me my money. And they'll give you the money. Because it's pages and pages and pages and pages of what you did. For just as an exercise, wait till we get later in the semester. Do a history log of one of your retouching sessions for this class and just see what you end up with. You'll be shocked. So anyway, that's way, and the reason to use history. I don't do retouching for other people, so I'm going to uncheck my history. I am not going to use that, but for those of you, believe me, if you go into it professionally, you want to do that. In file handling, you can leave this all at its defaults. You don't need to change anything here. Same thing about exporting. We will talk a lot about doing exporting in different reasons for different things. You can change things here. If you find out that you really are never exporting a PNG, you can actually change this to actually do JPEGs. This is what it used to be. This is strictly personal to you. I'm going to show you ways to actually export files that bypass all of this. So this part doesn't really matter to me, but at any rate, that's what it is. Performance, the next thing down, and this one's critical. How many people in this room have their own computer that's got a ton of RAM in it? 16 gigabytes of RAM or more. Anybody? Well, if you ever do get the Super Screamer machine, you can actually bump this level up. Right now, this is the amount of the default of RAM that's actually being devoted for Photoshop to run is 70%. That's what they always do it at. However, you need a certain amount of RAM to run your computer. Usually 20, 25 megabytes of RAM, something in that range there to actually be able to work your computer. It's a safe place to be. But if you've got a machine that's got an enormous amount of RAM, none of that's being actually used for Photoshop, and Photoshop eats this thing, eats RAM up. It's what actually makes Photoshop function really, really, really fast. So you can bump these numbers up. You don't want to go all the way up to 100% because then Photoshop will steal all of the RAM in your computer and your computer will stop working because it doesn't have any RAM to work on. Does that make sense to everyone? So if you're 16 gigabytes or under in your RAM, you can leave this alone. If you're more than that, you need to talk to me. We can probably bump that up. It will speed up your Photoshop for you. This use graphics processor should be enabled. Nobody in this room, is anybody in this room working with a computer that's over 7, 8 years old? That part will actually be fine then. History states, we leave this at 50 and cache levels at 4. History states are merely the number of steps in history that you can actually go through before you ultimately have to go, before you start losing a state in history. Does history states make sense? We'll talk about history states and cache in just a second. In the cache size right here, I'm going to actually leave this set up as it is right now because we're going to talk, this is related to the very next setting, scratch disks. How many people in this room have any idea what a scratch disk is? Can you tell me what it is?
It's something I always never have storage for. I always get annoyed.
Okay, so maybe that's the better question. How many people in here have gotten the dreaded your scratch disk is full? And you're fucked, right? You can't save your file. You can't, I mean, there's nothing that you can do. All you can actually do is quit. And if you haven't saved anything, you lose it, right? So we need to understand what these are because the next, and this is going to be really, really bad news for most of you guys. We're going to have to change something about your working situation. You're not going to see this on the video. You will hear the audio of this because I've got a wireless mic on here too. But we need to look at this whiteboard. So again, this is something, this goes back to what I was saying. Oh my God. Somebody went crazy with the markers. There's usually like one green marker here that's dry. So a little bit about how computers work. Again, this isn't, we're not going to go deep into it. This isn't going to be about CPU design or any of that kind of stuff. This goes back to what I was saying to you guys though earlier. If you understand the logic of this, then you'll understand what's causing these problems and how to avoid them happening to you. Because the minute you hit that warning, whatever, the pain that that causes you is just horrible. I mean, I've known people who've actually spent an entire day working without saving their work and hit a scratch disk full, and they lose everything. It's like the day starts over. And that's just, anyway. All right, so pardon my drawing. I'm a photographer because I'm not a person who draws. What would that be, an artist? Okay, so I'm going to do my computer right here. I'm going to put, this is just my computer. And I'm going to do an external hard drive. So this is my external hard drive, and we'll say that this is a, we'll just call it a terabyte hard drive. So it's a kind of a big boy. And I've got a single file on this guy that's a gigabyte in size. So it's my Photoshop image file. It's a picture that I'm working on. It's about a gigabyte in size. How many of you guys get up into that range? Gigabyte, 2 gigabytes? Yeah, you'll get in that way easily in this class. So at any rate, so this is my hard drive. This is my computer. Now my computer has, just to keep this simplified, I'm going to say it only has 4 gigabytes of RAM instead of 16. Most of your computers have 8 or 16. It's unusual to find 4, but I don't want to draw this. I don't want to keep drawing forever. So I'm just going to use an example of 4 gigabytes. Does that make sense to everybody? Are we okay with this part? Okay, so I'm going to do one here, one here, one here, and one here. And so what happens when you open up your Photoshop file, you double click on it, it reads it off the hard drive and it brings it into this first 1 gigabyte of RAM. So this is 1 gigabyte here, one here, one here, and one here. So it brings it into this and I can see it, and that's great. RAM is electronic. All it means is that when I do something in Photoshop, I just change the numbers. It's just that you imagine if you've got a 6 and I add a 4 to it, I've got a 10 instead. Well, that represents a change in Photoshop, and that's all it does. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, so I've got my image opened. I add a layer on top of it. I add an adjustment layer. Well, I've changed my image. Now I have 50 history states that I can work with, right? But what happens here is I make a change, and what happens in Photoshop, I'm going to get rid of these little gigabyte guys right here. What Photoshop does, it actually takes the information that's in here and drops it down into this second state, and this is the state up here now that's actually got the adjustment layer on it. This was the original layer when I opened it. This has now got the adjustment layer on it. Does that make sense, everyone? And that way I can do a quick undo. If I say I undo, it simply goes back to this state. Does that make sense? We good on this part? Okay, but then I do a second thing. What else? I do some text. I put in the text tool and I do some text. So what Photoshop does is it knows there's been a change. So now it actually puts the original state in here. This is the original plus the adjustment layer. And this is the original plus the adjustment layer plus the text. Does that make sense? Then I do one more thing. I actually do a levels correction on it as well. This is the original. This is the original plus the adjustment layer. The original plus the adjustment layer plus the text. The original plus the adjustment layer plus the text plus the levels adjustment. Does that make sense what's going on here? And so far everything's great. But I have 50 history states. This is only 4. Right? We've set it up to have 50 history states to go back, 50 undos, right? So what happens when I do the next trick to it, whatever it is, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a selection and save it on the image. You do the lasso tool something and save that. It's another state. What Photoshop does is it takes this original state and it writes it back to my hard drive in an invisible partition that you cannot see, and then everybody moves down again. Does that make sense what's going on? So it got, this is now, even though that's my original, this is my original file. This is now the original file with the adjustment layer, the original file with the adjustment layer with the text, the original file with the adjustment layer with the text, and what else do we do? And the levels. And this is the, you really are testing me. I told you I'm not a memory guy. This is the original file plus the adjustment layer plus the text plus the levels plus the selection. And this keeps going on. I do one more state, and the next one gets written back here to this. This is your scratch disk. It is an invisible partition that happens on your hard drive. You don't see it. It's invisible. But it keeps collecting these history states. If you are unfortunate enough that you actually fill your entire hard disk up with this scratch disk, you can't do anything because your hard disk is completely full. You can't save the file because all the room has been taken up by this invisible partition. Now, when you quit Photoshop, this partition goes away and you have all the room on your hard disk again. Does that make sense? That's what a scratch disk is. It's invisible, but it allows you to have far more history states than you normally would be able to have just based on the typical RAM that you would have in a computer. Are we good about that part? But this is why you get that dreaded message. You can't do anything else because it can't take any more states. It's already filled this whole thing up. And you can't save the file because this whole thing is filled up. Then again, this is temporary and invisible. When you quit, it goes away and you say, well, fuck that. I had all of this. I got 20 gigabytes of space on there. Are you kidding me? Anyway, scratch disk is all about. The problem that you guys have, and you're going to hate hearing this, but it is, you don't keep enough space on your hard drive inside of your computer to manage this kind of system. So most of you, we're going to take a look at mine really quickly. And again, for the Windows people, and guys, I've got an eye on the time. Don't worry, we're going to take a break pretty quickly here in just a second. In the Macintosh world, you can, I'm going to go back out to my Finder. I'm going to hide everybody else. This is my boot drive right here. I'm just going to hit Command-I. It gives me an information on it. And in this information, It tells me what size, what capacity my hard drive is. It's a 1 terabyte hard drive in here. I've got roughly 200 gigabytes available on this. I'm using roughly 700. That's basically what's going on here. The rule of thumb for all computer systems, Windows and Macintoshes, is a minimum of 10% available space on your hard drive. Most of you don't have anything close to that. Most of you guys have got your hard drives maxed out and you've got maybe a couple of gigabytes left over. You're all carrying all your videos and your everything else, whatever here. You can't do that. You've got to get that stuff off. A minimum of 20%, a minimum of 10% for your computer to function. That's not the scratch disk issue. The scratch disk typically that people will say that you want to have available to you is 60 gigabytes. Most people will not go above that. So what does that mean? If you have a terabyte hard drive, you need 100 gigabytes of free space just to have a computer running at its optimum speed without it having to do weird tricks. And the weird tricks will slow your computer down and they will also cause things to get corrupted and you'll lose shit. 10% of whatever. If you have a 250 gigabyte hard drive, you need 25 gigabytes free space. Again, the 10% rule. Does that make sense to everyone? However, if you're a serious Photoshop user, you need to add 60 gigabytes to that. My minimum threshold to have a screaming computer with no scratch disk issues is 160 gigabytes of free space on a terabyte hard drive. Are there questions about this?
What was the last amount you said?
Rarely will you get an issue where you'll go over 60 gigabytes for your scratch disk. Are we good on this part? You can actually add an external hard drive to become your scratch disk. I tell you what, let's do this, because this will give me a chance to actually build this, also the thumb drive for the people in Windows. Let's just call this 3 o'clock right now. Let's take a quick break. Let's make it a hard 15. If you guys can be back at 3:15, we will pick this up again. And that'll give me a chance to find my other hard drive and show you that, and also to build the assignment folder jump drive for the people who were unable to download all those files. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so let's take a break and I'll see you guys in 3:15.